Chapter 6. Befooled, Bewitched, and Bedevilled. Speculation in the Gilded Age. Speculation, at first a sentiment, or if you please a taste, passes next into a habit. Then it grows into a passion, a master passion, which like Aaron's serpent swallows up and strengthens itself with other passions. It becomes at last more fierce than anger, more gnawing than jealousy, more greedy than avarice, more absorbing than love. The stock market may be likened to a withered old harridan, enamelled, painted, and decked in the latest mode, which leers on the speculator and points to golden prizes that, like the desert mirage, fades away and leaves him to his ruin. William Fowler, 10 Years on Wall Street, 1870. The colonial movement was in the nature of a speculation. Columbus himself was a speculator, and North America the greatest speculative prize of all. The first American colonies were established as joint stock ventures. When Sir Walter Raleigh's Virginia Company was reorganized in the early 17th century, it promised investors a return of 20% and incorporated a subsidiary company for transporting 100 maids to Virginia to be made wives. A few years later, the settlement of New Amsterdam, later New York, was undertaken by the Dutch East India Company, whose shares at the time were the main object of speculation on the Amsterdam Bourse. In the middle of the 17th century, the Wall of Wall Street was constructed on the orders of Governor Stuyvesant of the Dutch West India Company. Towards the end of the century, shares in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania companies were traded in Exchange Alley, alongside the diving bell and fire engine ventures. Among other things, John Law's Mississippi Company comprised a speculation in half the territory of the modern United States. The speculative character of the American people derives in great measure from the colonial venture. The American dream is posited on the vision of a beneficent, ever-improving future. The difference between an American and any other person is that the American lives in anticipation of the future because he knows what a great place it will be, said Ronald Reagan with his characteristic mixture of folksy sentimentality and insight. The American settlers had forsaken their historic lands for a nation whose boundaries were limited only by their dreams. As the 19th century financial writer William Fowler observed, imagination in this country lives in the future rather than the past. Only in America could a man declare that history was bunk. America is a democratic nation where social status is up for grabs, and wealth, not birth, provides the ultimate measure of distinction. During his American travels in the early 1830s, the French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville observed a vibrant spirit of materialism. "I never met in America," he wrote, "any citizen so poor as not to cast a glance of hope and envy on the enjoyments of the rich, or whose imagination did not possess itself by anticipation of those good things which fate still obstinately withheld from him." The love of well-being has now become the predominant taste of the nation. The great current of human passions runs in that channel and sweeps everything along its course. The American is equipped with more than just a hopeful vision of the future and a drive for self-improvement. He is prepared to take enormous risks to attain his ends. To emigrate to America was in itself a great risk. Settlement of the frontier involved even greater risks, such as fending off Indians and wild animals. Many of the great 19th century speculators came from the frontier regions. This appetite for risk, so great that one might say it was imprinted in American genes, has not diminished with time, but remains a continuing source of the nation's vitality. Even rich Americans found themselves dissatisfied with their lot and were prepared to gamble to improve it. After a stock market panic in the late 19th century, the London Spectator commented bemusedly, "The millionaires of America make corners as if they had nothing to lose. Let some amuse themselves financing as if it were only an expensive game. The English, however speculative, fear poverty. The Frenchman shoots himself to avoid it. The American with 1,000,000 speculates to win 10, and if he loses, takes a clerkship with equanimity. This freedom from sordidness is commendable, but it makes a nation of the most degenerate gamesters in the world. Risk is, of course, the essence of speculation. The textbook economic function of speculation is the assumption of risk, and no one is prepared to assume more risk than the American speculator. At times, the transfer of risk in the stock market goes beyond the inevitable risks of business and becomes an end in itself. Under such circumstances, speculation becomes purely ludic, a national sport played with the ferocity of war and offering the rewards of a lottery. It may appear paradoxical that Americans love equality, having enshrined it as a founding principle in the Declaration of Independence, and yet they strive ceaselessly to create material inequality amongst themselves. They have swept away the privileges of their fellow creatures, wrote Tocqueville, which stood in their way, but they have opened the door to universal competition. The barrier has changed its shape rather than position. In a democratic society, such as the United States, where wealth is the ultimate determinant of status, there lingers a constant fear of being left behind materially. We may say that the guiding principle of American society is not to grow richer in absolute terms, but to avoid becoming poorer in relative terms. And nothing makes a man feel poorer than being a passive bystander during a bull market. Therefore, the fiercest struggle for the preservation and restitution of economic equality in the United States takes place in the stock market, where everyone is seeking to discover what others are doing and anticipate what they intend to do. As Keynes observed with all the cultured disdain of the old world for the new, even outside the field of finance, Americans are apt to be unduly interested in discovering what average opinion believes average opinion to be, and this national weakness finds its nemesis in the stock market. The early history of speculation in America. America's vast wilderness invited speculation. Many of the country's founding fathers were land speculators. George Washington started his own Mississippi Company to purchase lands in the West. Benjamin Franklin was involved in an Illinois land speculation of 63 million acres. Patrick Henry, the fiery revolutionary, was among the investors in the Yazoo Company, which attempted to purchase 10 million acres in Georgia. Even Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were occasional land jobbers. For a century after independence, the country was in a constant ferment of land speculation. In the late 18th century, millions of acres in large blocks were exchanged in Maine, Georgia, and New York State. The developing towns and cities were also the objects of speculation. Fittingly, the capital city, Washington, D.C., was founded by land speculators. 40 years later, Chicago was the new boom town. Later still, the railroads opened up the western part of the country to the national pastime. The railroads themselves, established with federal land grants that exceeded 170 million acres, were primarily vehicles for land speculation. Were I to characterize the United States, wrote the English traveller William Priest in the late 18th century, it would be by the appellation of the land of speculations. The stock market did not appear in New York until after American independence. In the 1790s, a speculative mania in government loans and bank stocks developed not unlike that found in Exchange Alley a century earlier. There was, however, a significant difference. From its very inception, the American market was dominated by stock operators whose activities were on a scale unsurpassed in the Old World. In late 1791, William Duer, an Eton-educated former colonel in Washington's army, organized a pool with the intention of driving up the share price of the Bank of the United States. He financed this speculation with personal notes of credit for a reported $30 million. Duer's subsequent failure brought the first U.S. stock market crash and led to his eventual death in prison. Although corners were as old as the stock markets themselves, it was only in America in the 19th century that they became a hallmark of speculation. The aim of the corner was to acquire a sufficient number of shares to force up the price and catch out the bears who had sold stock short in anticipation of buying it back cheaper at a later date. When a stock was effectively cornered, the operator could demand any price he wished from the short sellers, who were legally obliged to cover their positions. As the great stock operator Daniel Drew mused, "He who sells what isn't his'n must buy it back or go to prison." Corners were normally undertaken by informal speculative partnerships, known as pools, and accompanied by devious market manipulation. It was a tense game and often failed. The stock market operator, who arranged corners and manipulated the market, became a familiar figure. The typical operator was described by a mid-century commentator as an individual of Bonapartean capacity, who has risen with the velocity of a comet, for a while carries everything before him, and raises and depresses any particular stock or stocks at his sovereign will and pleasure. The favoured stocks of operators became known as footballs because they were so frequently kicked around between the bulls and the bears. They were also called fancies. Often broken-down companies of little intrinsic value, they served the function of gambling chips, like certain penny stocks in the over-the-counter market in America today. Around the middle of the 19th century, the call loan system emerged. Although loans against the collateral of stock, known to Americans as call or margin loans, had been available in Amsterdam since the early 17th century, they came to dominate the New York stock market to an unprecedented degree. Stock loans were supplied by New York banks to brokers who lodged their customers' securities as collateral. The credit was termed call because the banks could demand or call it back at any moment. They were also called margin loans, since there was a margin of safety between the size of the loan and the security's market value. This margin varied from a relatively conservative 20% to 5% or less. Thus, a share trading at $100 was good for a loan of between $80 and $95. If the market was particularly volatile, or if the shares used as collateral were speculative footballs, then a higher margin was normally demanded. When the shares held on margin declined in value, the broker demanded more cash from his customer, known as a margin call, and if this was not forthcoming, he would sell the stocks in the market. The regular supply of margin loans to the stock market was a great boon to brokers, as it enabled small-time speculators to make bigger purchases than they could otherwise afford, and stimulated market turnover. "The word margins," wrote William Fowler in 10 Years on Wall Street, contains the essence of stock speculation. Although stock market loans had been available since the 1830s, for the next decade options and futures, known as time transactions, remained more common. In the 1850s, however, people started to complain that the growth of call loans was squeezing out legitimate commercial borrowers. After the crash of 1857, known as the Western Blizzard, time transactions began to fade away. At around this time, a stock market commentator described speculators using call loans to pyramid their investments, selling existing holdings after a rise and doubling up. The abundant supply of short-term credit to speculators made the stock market more than usually sensitive to monetary conditions. Bankers' balances in New York, from which call loans were supplied, varied with the agricultural cycle. When wheat was due to be shipped east, money would flow to the interior of the country, leading to a tightness in the New York money market and the calling of loans from the stock market. This tendency was strongest in October, traditionally a black-letter month for American speculators. Money flowed back to New York at the beginning of the year, making it a good season for speculation. Call loans increased the volatility of a stock market already subject to constant manipulation and corners. During a stock market crisis, call rates rose sharply and loans were withdrawn, but because liquidity in the stock market dried up and borrowers were unable to sell securities, banks often experienced difficulty in retrieving their loans. The effect of the call loan system was therefore to make American banks especially vulnerable to panics, when customers would protect themselves by withdrawing bank deposits and hoarding money. Brokers made matters worse by selling their customers' margin stocks during a panic in order to protect themselves. A margin, wrote William Fowler, may be called a device contrived to create crisis and panics and to keep the market in a ferment, so that brokers may make and their customers lose money. War and speculation. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 ushered in a new era of speculation. Initially, the stock market was apprehensive about war, and leading stocks declined sharply after the attack on Fort Sumter. Conditions changed in early 1862 after Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the issue of $150 million worth of a new paper currency, the greenback. Gradually, speculators realized that industry and agriculture would be stimulated by the need to equip, clothe, and feed the Union forces, and that the greenbacks would bring inflation into the system. A few months after the passing of the Act, the stock market began to rise as the greenbacks worked their effect on the economy, like the kiss of the prince on the cheek of a sleep-enchanted lady in the fairy tale. The uncertainty of war produced an ideal climate for speculation. As the stock operator Daniel Drew said, "Along with ordinary happenings, we fellows in Wall Street had the fortunes of war to speculate about, and that makes great doings on a stock exchange. It's good fishing in troubled waters." The price of gold became the barometer of military fortunes. It crashed whenever the Union was victorious, for fear that the supply of greenbacks would dry up, and climbed on news of defeat as the market anticipated further note issues. The gold bulls whistled Dixie, and the bears sang John Brown's Body. With bold forward movements and subtle feints, grand strategy and clever tactics, and endless skirmishing between bulls and bears, events on Wall Street mimicked the war itself. Despite a great disparity in their moral ends, war and speculation have much in common. Clausewitz's description of war as the province of uncertainty, subject to unforeseen accidents or friction, applies just as well to stock market speculation. What George Soros has called reflexivity, the influence of subjective factors on outcomes, has its place on the battlefield as well as in the stock market. Morale could determine the outcome of both military and speculative battles, where daring and brilliance might snatch an unexpected victory, and panic and disorder bring defeat. The Lees, Grants, and Shermans had their counterparts in the great stock operators, who bribed soldiers, sutlers, politicians, and telegraph operators in order to get the latest information from the front. The mercenary corps of Wall Street were fickle alliances, and the speculative history of the period is marked by constant betrayals and double dealings. Yet occasionally, for brief periods, the forces of speculation marshalled by the stock operators displayed the cohesion and discipline of a professional army. Like the generals of the Civil War, the leading operators attracted public adulation. As Matthew Josephson wrote in The Robber Barons, "If the doctrine of the nation favoured an ideal of free and equal opportunity for all, so its current folklore glorified the freebooting citizen who, by his own efforts, by whatever method feasible, had wrested for himself a power that flung its shadow upon the liberties and privileges of others." James Fisk, Jay Gould, and Cornelius Vanderbilt were the heroes of the Gilded Age. Their operations brought them national fame, and their fortunes were the object of envious admiration. In times of panic, however, these men were vilified for their lack of scruple, and the walls of the long room, where the share dealings of the open board took place, were covered with graffiti cursing their names. The most renowned and feared stock operator in the early 1860s was Daniel Drew, known variously as the Great Bear, the Old Bear, and Ursa Major, due to his preference for selling stocks short, the Sphinx of Wall Street for his inscrutability, the Old Man of the Street for his age, and more familiarly as Uncle Daniel. He was born the son of a poor farmer from Putnam County, New York, in 1797. After deserting from the army to join the circus, he worked as cattle drover before eventually settling in Wall Street. Although Drew was a devout Baptist who endowed churches and even a ladies' seminary, he had no difficulty in reconciling his religion with the amorality of the stock market, where his own treachery was notorious. Charles Francis Adams described him as shrewd, unscrupulous, and very illiterate, a strange combination of superstition and faithlessness, of daring and timidity, often good-natured and sometimes generous. In the early 1850s, Drew had joined the board of the Erie Railroad. He became notorious for his operations in Erie stock, which earned him the sobriquet of the speculative director, and the railroad that of the Scarlet Woman of Wall Street. He manipulated the Erie share price with such facility that it became a saying on Wall Street that, when Daniel says up, Erie goes up. Daniel says down, Erie goes down. Daniel says wiggle waggle, it bobs both ways. He liked nothing better than to mislead his boys, as he called the younger speculators, about his intentions, and revelled in taking a slice out of them. As a young drover, Drew had fed his cattle with salt before bringing them to market so that they would drink and put on weight. In later years, he introduced to Wall Street the practice of watering stock. This involved using his position as a director to issue vast unauthorized quantities of new stock in order to depress the share price and thwart attempted corners. A disgruntled speculator accused Drew of treating his stocks just as he used to treat cattle. He pens 'em, drives 'em up and down the market, corners 'em. In fact, Daniel Drew calls stocks his critters and abuses them accordingly. He waters them and plasters them all over with dirt till they are not worth shucks. The other leading operator of the day, Cornelius Vanderbilt, struck a sharp contrast to his rival Drew. The old drover was unkempt, wizened, and sinewy, whereas Commodore Vanderbilt was tall, handsome, and finely dressed, with a face like a Roman senator. Drew had a hen-like cackle, Vanderbilt a booming laugh. Drew cared nothing for the management of railroads, and concentrated exclusively on his stock market speculations. Vanderbilt succeeded in building a great network of railroads. It was said that Vander built and Dan drew. Drew was sly and gave out false tips. Vanderbilt was mostly open in his dealings and never informed anyone of his intentions. In a crisis, Drew became flustered and lost his nerve. Vanderbilt's will was unbreakable and his purpose always firm. But for all their differences, the two men had much in common. They were both illiterate, ruthless, grasping men. Vanderbilt was said to raise men up in the street only to break them, to have fleeced his son-in-law, Horace Clark, of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and even to have misled his son William into selling a stock which he was buying. On one occasion, Vanderbilt sent a brief note to associates who had betrayed him. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I will not sue you, for the law takes too long. I will ruin you." He kept his promise. Beneath the titanic figures of Drew and Vanderbilt stood a host of lesser operators, who experienced fleeting moments of success before they disappeared into obscurity. In 1863, Addison Jerome enjoyed a brief reign as the Napoleon of the public board, when he organized several successful corners. After only a few months, however, he was bankrupted by a failed corner in the Michigan and Southern Railroad. A year later, he died from a heart attack induced by the pressures of work. His brother, Leonard Jerome, first rose to prominence in the 1850s, when he made a fortune anticipating the stock market crisis of 1857. His operations were characterized by great boldness and animal spirits, and even when disaster threatened, he always maintained his good humor. Unlike his brother, Leonard did not overstay his welcome on Wall Street, but departed for Europe with his fortune intact. His beautiful daughter Jenny married Lord Randolph Churchill, a descendant of that shrewd South Sea speculator Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough. Their son, Winston, exhibited the same indomitable spirit and sang-froid that had marked his grandfather's operations in the stock market. Henry Keep, born in a poorhouse and a former bootblack, was another leading operator of the early 1860s. It was Keep who broke Addison Jerome's attempted corner in Old Southern by issuing new shares. Known as Henry the Silent, Keep had a reputation for discretion and probity rare among his fellow operators. He set up the first blind pool, in which a number of speculators combined their resources without being informed by Keep of what he intended to do with their money. They were kept blind to prevent news of the pool's operations from leaking into the market. The most dashing operator of the Civil War era was Anthony Morse, known as the English Jew for his hooked nose and financial acumen. He was also nicknamed the Lightning Calculator. Morse came to prominence with a blind pool organized in Rock Island in late 1863. Early the following year, he became the leader of the Bull faction, bidding openly for stocks in blocks of 5 or 10 million shares. At the height of his fame, crowds surrounded Morse's brokerage office, and he was mobbed by strangers who thrust their wallets into his hands and begged for tips. His failure in the spring of 1864 caused a panic on the exchange. Ostracized, Morse haunted Broadway for a year and died penniless in a seedy boarding house, where his landlady refused to release the corpse until his bills were paid. A contemporary considered Morse a brilliant mathematician and a shrewd financier, but like most great speculators, he got at last to believe in his star. Then he attempted impossibilities. The Gilded Age, as Mark Twain and his co-author Charles Dudley Warner observed in the novel which gave its name to the period, was a time when everybody nursed a speculation, and people pursued the acquisition of wealth by fair means or foul. The rags-to-riches tales of Horatio Alger that appeared after the Civil War, with titles such as Fame and Fortune and Strive and Succeed, presented an idealized version of the same fierce material ambition. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, described the era as the period of periods when there was a kind of adoration of the capitalist taught in the press, college, and pulpit. Egregious displays of wealth characterized the age, inspiring Thorstein Veblen's ideas on conspicuous consumption, expounded in his Theory of the Leisure Class. At society parties, cigarettes were rolled in $100 bills, black pearls were stuffed into the guests' oysters, and dogs were adorned with diamond-studded collars. Gold, the source of many speculative fortunes, was also the most desirable thing to have, according to Elizabeth Lair, in King Lear and the Gilded Age, because it cost money, and money was the outward and visible sign of success. Throughout the 1860s, fortunes were gained and expended with equal rapidity. It was alleged that the speculators' vicious extravagance was motivated by a desire to take revenge on the money that had cost them so much anxiety to gain. No speculator was more extravagant and high-living than Leonard Jerome, who drove through Central Park with a team of dazzling thoroughbreds, purchased a magnificent steam yacht, built a racecourse and a private theatre, and distributed diamond bracelets as gifts to the ladies at his sumptuous dinner parties. Some contemporary commentators were disgusted by such vulgar displays of wealth. The journalist E. L. Godkin, founder of The Nation, described America in 1866 as a gaudy stream of bespangled, belaced, and beruffled barbarians. When Georges Clemenceau, the future French Prime Minister, visited the United States after the Civil War, he concluded that the country had passed from a state of barbarism to one of decadence, without an intermediate period of civilization. The Civil War in America, with its enormous issue of depreciating currency and its reckless waste of money and credit by the government, created a speculative mania such as the United States, with all its experience in this respect, had never before known, wrote Henry Adams. Not only in Broad Street, the centre of New York speculation, but far and wide throughout the northern states, almost every man who had money at all employed a part of his capital in the purchase of stocks, or of gold, of copper, of petroleum, or of domestic produce, in the hope of a raise in prices, or staked money on the expectation of a fall. The expansion of the railway system and the advent of the telegraph fostered speculation by bringing far-flung places into daily contact with the financial centre. In 1867, the ticker was introduced, flashing the latest stock prices around the country and linking provincial brokerage offices to Wall Street. By the end of the century, it was estimated that nearly half of all messages transmitted by telegraph involved speculative transactions. The ticker also gave birth to the bucket shop, which was a cross between a betting shop and a brokerage, where people could gamble on share price movements without actually buying the stocks, in other words, the same effect as buying futures. Bucket shops were shady places, whose owners were often engaged in manipulating stocks, and had a reputation for disappearing into the night when faced with a large payout. Nevertheless, they provided many with their first taste of speculation, and remained popular until the 1930s, when they were outlawed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Although the total number of speculators during the Civil War is uncertain, contemporaries believed the figure to be far larger than the 200,000 holders of stocks and bonds in the previous decade. They came from all classes and backgrounds. On the sidewalks of the financial district, young dandy speculators from Broadway jostled with farmers, store owners, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, mechanics, and penniless gutter snipes. Clerks formed small clubs in order to pool their limited resources, and shady brokers offered to finance them with the slimmest of margin cover, ensuring that the slightest setback would see them wiped out. Outside brokerage offices, lady speculators waited in their carriages for news of the latest stock prices. In Saratoga, upstate New York, 3 young ladies set up a pool in Harlem stock and bought 2,000 shares. Vanderbilt's former mistress, Mrs. Tennessee Claflin, and her sister, Mrs. Victoria Woodhull, established their own brokerage in Broad Street in 1870, and became known as the Bewitching Brokers. Hetty Green, the Quaker heiress, dressed from head to foot in black crape, with black-gloved hands resembling talons, was a familiar figure on Wall Street. She bought shrewdly during panics, succeeded in cornering the noted operator Addison Camac, once threatened the railroad baron Collis Huntington with a revolver, and even brought about a minor stock market panic when the withdrawal of her account caused her brokers to fail. Vindictive, garrulous, and neurotically fearful of poverty, when staying in hotels she was said to save money by washing her own underwear, Hetty Green was a cautious operator who believed in getting in at the bottom and selling out at the top. "All you have to do is buy cheap and sell dear, act with thrift and shrewdness, and be persistent," was her advice to other speculators. Wall Street is not the place for a lady to find either fortune or character, claimed the stockbroker Henry Clews. Yet Hetty Green became the richest woman in America, and died with a fortune estimated at over $100 million. As for her character, the Witch of Wall Street was as feared and disliked as any of her male counterparts. Male or female, rich or poor, healthy or infirm, the vast majority of speculators were necessarily outsiders, mere fodder for the great operators. It was a saying of the drover Drew that anybody who plays the stock market not as an insider is like a man buying cows in the moonlight. So efficient were the operators at fleecing outsiders that Henry Adams feared speculation would eventually consume itself, as the largest combination of capital was destined to swallow every weaker combination which ventured to show itself in the market. Even if the speculator evaded the operator's snares, he was likely to fall prey to his own weaknesses. Fowler depicted the amateur speculator as the opium eater of finance, a man torn by conflicting passions, beset by uncertainty and fears, prone to buying high and selling low, befooled, bewitched, and bedevilled by what he hears in the market. James Medbury claimed that outsiders were prey to suspicion, overconfidence, timidity, and vacillation when they entered the stock market. "You will find confidence," he wrote, "where the registry shows there should have been distrust, hesitation which ought to have been daring, doubts where faith would have been wealth. This weakness of humanity is the life of speculation. Not all outsiders, however, were unsuccessful. Some speculators, known as panic birds, came to the market only once prices had crashed and money was scarce. They bought carefully, locked up their investments, and kept away from Wall Street until the next calamity struck. But they were a rare breed, and most who ventured into the financial district in the turbulent years of the 1860s became entranced by the carnival atmosphere and remained there until the last penny had been picked from their pockets. New exchanges, old bubbles. A number of new exchanges were established to accommodate the growing fever. The most important of them, the Open Board, founded in 1862 to compete with the older exchange, operated initially from a subterranean coal hole in William Street. When the new exchange prospered, the tiny basements around William Street were turned into offices for fly-by-night operators, offering brokerage services at reduced commission rates. At its peak, the Open Board was said to transact 10 times as much business as the regular board. The two markets merged in 1869 to form the New York Stock Exchange. In February 1864, an evening exchange was set up in the basement of the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Speculators paid 50 cents to enter, and trading lasted until 9 o'clock at night, after which business continued in the hotel's bar. Curbstone brokers also traded in William Street, between Exchange Place and Beaver Street, where gutter snipes enticed bystanders by brandishing their arms and vociferating loudly. These new markets had none of the exclusivity and pretension to rectitude of the old exchange. Outsiders were encouraged to mingle in the crowd, and brokers provided credit on small margins to finance their speculations. With the price of gold floating after the advent of greenbacks, the Gold Room became the venue for some of the most daring and celebrated speculative feats of the period. Situated at Gilpin's Reading Room on the corner of William Street and Exchange Place, the room itself was modest and undistinguished, a dingy hall full of nooks where speculators lurked. In its centre stood a cast-iron Cupid, splashing water into a bowl, tinkling and clinking like coin of gold, around which gathered brokers shouting out their offers and bids. In the background the telegraph clattered noisily, and on one wall was placed a large dial, whose arm swung to and fro, indicating the latest price. A similar dial on an exterior wall signalled the price to crowds of speculators on the street. Speculation in the Gold Room was said to be purer and more intense than in the stock market. According to the journalist Horace White, the room resembled a rat pit in full blast. For James Medbury, the Gold Room was a human maelstrom, where men battle for gold, 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 with a naked greed and fury that satirizes life beyond all imaginings. Gold speculation reached a climax in early 1864, when a new gold exchange opened. Since the prices of gold and other metals were rising faster than wages, it was natural that the attention of speculators should turn to mining. A mining board was established in March, and nearly 200 mining companies, with a capital of over $300 million, were floated in the following month. These new companies were ventures in distant territories. Exotic names adorned them, such as the Arizona Metalliferous and Scalping Ledge Gold and Silver Mining Company, the Mount St. Elias Silver Lode and Gold Vein Mining Company, the Alligator Bayou Salt Company, and the Angel's Rest Quicksilver Company. Brokers, eager to attract custom, affected a knowledge of fissure veins, faults, spurs, lodes, pyrites, and other mining terms, and filled their offices with cabinets containing assays of gold and specimens of other metals and minerals. The promoters of the mining companies harnessed the mood of the day with age-old ploys. First, a claim in some unknown place was purchased for a pittance in cash or a quantity of shares, and specimens of ore were submitted to an assay and certificated by a mineralogist. Then a wealthy and respectable merchant, joined by other notables, was brought onto the board in return for a free distribution of shares. the capital of the company would be inflated to many times its value. For instance, the property of the Titan Ledge and Black Mountain Gold, Silver, and Copper Company was bought for $1,000 and later capitalized at $1 million. A broker was hired and advertisements placed in the papers announcing a limited subscription. On street corners, boys were employed to hand out prospectuses with lavish descriptions of the company's prospects. Scouts, known as bubble blowers, were hired to lure the bigger investors. Several companies were brought under the control of the same directors, who used the capital raised for one company to pay the unearned dividends of another. The mining mania took place against the background of rising gold prices and a bull market led exuberantly by Anthony Morse. When Morse failed on the 18th of April 1864, there was a panic in the stock market, in which mining company stocks declined by an average of more than 90%. Eventually, speculators came to heed Mark Twain's warning that a mine is a hole in the ground with a liar standing next to it. Although the market was quiet for a few months after the collapse of the mining mania, by late summer exuberance had returned. In early 1865, a new bubble was blown, this time tinged with the translucent colors of petroleum, a new wonder product hailed as a disinfectant, a vermin killer, hair oil, boot grease, and a cure for kidney stones. During this boom, which was linked to the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, the price of crude oil increased ninefold within a few months, reaching a level that in real terms has never been equaled. The brokers cleared their offices of mineral samples and certificates of assay, and in their place installed models of oil barrels, files of petroleum, and framed property deeds. A petroleum board was inaugurated in October 1865, and 35 companies were floated. In a rerun of the mining mania, new companies were formed at little or no cost, fraudulent claims to oil-rich land were incorporated into companies with inflated capitalizations, and petroleum stocks were heavily manipulated. Shares were run up to a great height before the petroleum bubble evaporated into thin air. Milking the street. The great stock operators did not trifle with the transient mining and petroleum bubbles. Their attention was focused almost exclusively on the market for railroad stocks, where manipulation was a fine art and consequently the investment returns more certain. The great aim of the operator was to achieve one of the railroad corners, which recurred with unprecedented frequency throughout the period. Among the most notorious corners were those in Harlem, 1863 and 1864, Michigan Southern, 1863 and 1866, Prairie du Chien, 1865, Erie, 1866, 1867 and 1868, and Chicago and Northwestern, 1867 and 1872. The profits could be enormous. Henry Keep's pool in the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad in 1867 netted over $2 million. These operations were not without danger, as corners could be broken by watering existing stock with new issues or by repatriating stock held in Europe. Therein lay the excitement of the game. A pool operator would start by simulating weakness in a particular stock in order to shake out those holders on small margins and entice others to sell the stock short. This was known as the partridge trick. The pool even lent from its own stockholding to facilitate short sales. Disreputable brokers provided wash sales, which set misleading prices. In a market hungry for points, or tips, false rumors were rife. Broken speculators, known as pointers, singed cats, or ropers-in, were commissioned to put out specious stories and solicit short sales. False rumors became so common that many acted contrary to what they were advised in the market, a practice known as coppering. Once the stock had been oversold, the operator would catch out the short sellers and force up the price. This was known as the scoop game. A corrupt press was a useful tool in the hands of a stock manipulator. The notorious operator Jay Gould, of whom more later, controlled several newspaper editors, who in exchange for share tips would print whatever story he told them. After his death, the New York Times remarked, Mr. Gould's editors were known to the public as stool pigeons. It was their function to entice the incautious investor or speculator within reach of his ammunition, to hammer securities that he wished to acquire, and to exalt by artful misrepresentation the quotations of those he desired to unload. Away from the stock exchange, other ways were found to manipulate securities. Influence over the board of directors was the most common and effective method, as Daniel Drew had shown with the Erie Railroad. Drew was frequently a bear, even in the stock of his own company, since his ability to issue new Erie shares made it almost impossible for the other operators to corner him. Railway directors, wrote James Medbury, are the heavy artillery of the stock market, and no corner can attain Napoleonic victory without them. Directors manipulated dividends to suit their speculative activities, sometimes paying them out of capital, broadcast false rumours. In 1869, the directors of the Pacific Mail circulated stories of an impending dividend increase in order to unload their shares, passed expected dividends, and issued unauthorized stock. Occasionally, speculating directors went even further. When Jim Fisk was a director of the Erie Railroad, he sold short the stock of the United States Express Company, which had a contract with the Erie, and then cancelled the contract. Once the Express Company's share price had fallen, Fisk covered his shorts, bought more shares, and then reinstated the contract. This technique was refined later in the century by the notorious gambler and speculator John Bettermillion Gates, who shut down his Chicago steel plant during a period of prosperity and put thousands out of work, claiming that the business was not making money. Like Fisk beforehand, Gates had sold the stock short, and after making a killing in the market, he reopened his factories. The behaviour of speculating directors corrupted the relationship between directors and shareholders, especially the British shareholders, who on the other side of the Atlantic were unable to influence events and were led like lambs to the slaughter. It appeared to justify Adam Smith's claim that joint stock companies were beset by negligence and profusion, since the personal interests of directors differed from those of their shareholders. In his Theory of Business Enterprise, Thorstein Veblen contended that it was the custom of American directors to mislead the stock market in order to profit from successive over- and undervaluations of stock. Jay Gould, who once described the Erie Railroad as his plaything, was accused by Matthew Josephson of pursuing a deliberate policy of mismanagement as a matter of principle, deriving his gains from the discrepancies between the real value of the affair and its supposed or transient value in the securities markets. In good times he would give an appearance of gauntness and misery to his enterprises. In bad times he would pretend affluence. The example of Gould and many contemporary directors perhaps explains why ordinary stocks in 19th-century America provided a higher yield than fixed-interest bonds, despite the growing wealth of the nation. Directorial depredations and speculations meant that the ownership of shares carried an added uncertainty, justifying what one might call an agency risk premium. Even the federal government was entangled in the national web of speculation. The process of milking the state came very close to that of milking the street. In Twain and Warner's The Gilded Age, Congress resembles a caricature of the stock market, where votes are traded, lobbyists assume the role of stock operators, whom they match in guile and intrigue, members of Congress take the part of brokers, and battles between opposing factions for federal grants and appropriations are engaged with a passion and excitement similar to the contests between the bulls and the bears on Wall Street. Like broken speculators on the curb, the shabby old claimants who loiter around the Capitol are sustained by nothing save eternal hope. When he arrives in Washington, Colonel Sellers, an irrepressible speculator, is in his native element. Philip Sterling, the novel's hero, on the other hand, finds Washington the maddest Vanity Fair one could conceive. It seemed to him a feverish, unhealthy atmosphere, in which lunacy could be easily developed. Throughout the Civil War, Washington swarmed with war contractors eager to make a fast buck. Cornelius Vanderbilt furnished the Navy with unseaworthy vessels, the young Pierpont Morgan sold faulty carbines to the army, and other contractors supplied goods to the government that were equally shoddy. The words derived from a material made from shredded rags used for Union soldiers' coats. This Vanity Fair on the Potomac, where everything was for sale, took its place alongside the Carnival of Speculation, William Fowler's phrase, on the banks of the Hudson. The satire of the Gilded Age was directed against the venality of Washington politicians exposed by the Credit Mobilier scandal in 1872. A decade earlier, the Union Pacific Railroad, parodied in the novel as the Salt Lick Pacific Extension, had been established, with the aid of vast federal land grants and loans, to provide the first transcontinental rail connection. After the Civil War, the railroad fell into the hands of a businessman named Oakes Ames, who was also a member of Congress. Ames created a holding company, the Credit Mobilier, through which all the railroad's construction contracts were placed. This presented a perfect opportunity for graft. Construction costs were inflated, for which the Credit Mobilier received Union Pacific shares in payment. That is to say, the shareholders of the Union Pacific were milked to provide profits for the shareholders of Credit Mobilier. In December 1867, the Credit Mobilier declared a dividend equal to its entire capital, and its stock soared to $260 a share. In order to maintain support in Washington, Ames distributed Credit Mobilier shares freely to a number of politicians, including the future President James Garfield, the future Vice President Schuyler Colfax, the leading Republican James Blaine, and many other senators and railway congressmen. By the time the scandal was uncovered, it was estimated that Ames and his group had plundered nearly $44 million from the Union Pacific. Credit Mobilier was the most prominent of many examples of political corruption involving railroads and federal grants, going back to the 1850s. After the election of President Grant in 1868, the unsavory intimacy between the federal government and business interests deepened, providing an ideal breeding ground for speculation and corruption. At the lower levels of government, the fusion of political venality and financial speculation was laid bare by the two celebrated Harlem corners of 1863 and 1864. Since the beginning of the war, Vanderbilt had been buying up Harlem Railroad stock in an attempt to gain control of Wall Street's favorite football. In late April 1863, the New York City authorities gave the railroad permission to run streetcars down Broadway. Not long after, the stock market surged, with Harlem, whose share price more than doubled, leading the way. Once Harlem had peaked at 75, the city's aldermen colluded to sell Harlem short before rescinding permission to build the Broadway line. Unfortunately for them, Vanderbilt had picked up so much stock that its price kept on rising, reaching a peak of nearly 180 in August, when the city's representatives found themselves cornered. Unable to cover their shorts because Vanderbilt already owned all the available shares, they were obliged to settle with him. History repeated itself the following April, when the New York legislators in Albany, coaxed on by Daniel Drew, refused permission for the Harlem extension. On this occasion, Vanderbilt and his ally John M. Tobin succeeded in buying up 27,000 more Harlem shares than were in circulation. In early July, the price of Harlem shot to over $1,000, and the legislators were forced to treat with the Commodore, to his enormous profit and pleasure. "We busted the whole legislature, and scores of the honorable members had to go home without paying their bills," he boasted. Having burnt their fingers at direct speculation, the New York legislators reverted to the more certain profits of bribery. 4 years later, in 1868, they opened their pockets wide to receive the largesse distributed during the so-called Erie War. This event, recorded by Charles Francis Adams, Jr. in Chapters of Erie, concerned Vanderbilt's attempted takeover of the Erie Railroad, which was thwarted by Daniel Drew and his younger Confederates, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. Defying court injunctions and hiring a judge of their own, the Erie Gang, as they became known, dropped millions of dollars worth of new Erie shares on the market. Afterwards, they repaired with their spoils to Jersey City, beyond the reach of New York's jurisdiction. Gould subsequently travelled to Albany with $500,000 in cash. Needless to say, the money technically belonged to Erie shareholders, in order to bribe the legislators to validate retrospectively the new issue of shares. Vanderbilt played the same game, but was defeated by Gould at what Adams called the Legislative Brokers' Board, where votes are daily counted. The total expenditure on bribes in Albany during the summer of 1868 was estimated to exceed $1 million. J. Gould's Black Friday. The victory of the Erie gang marked the sudden ascendancy of J. Gould and James Fisk among the leading group of stock market operators. Together they comprised the oddest couple ever to enter Wall Street. James Fisk was the son of a Vermont peddler who had worked first in the circus, then as a dry goods merchant in Boston, and subsequently as a cotton smuggler during the war. In the early 1860s he came to Wall Street, where he was taken up as Drew's protégé. He was a tubby, expansive extrovert with a large walrus moustache on a face framed by fair kiss curls, who loved dressing up in absurd uniforms. In the summer of 1869, Fisk entertained President Grant on his pleasure boat, dressed in a blue uniform with a gilt cap band, 3 silver stars on his coat sleeve, lavender gloves, and a diamond breastpin as large as a cherry. His operatic attire was not out of place in Pike's Grand Opera House, which Fisk purchased as the headquarters for the Erie Railroad. Inside this marble palace, Prince Erie Jim Jubilee Admiral James Fisk, Jr. was enthroned, surrounded by a harem drawn from a troupe of ballet dancers. Jim Fisk was, in Henry Adams's description, coarse, noisy, boastful, ignorant, the type of a young butcher in appearance and mind, who considered his Wall Street operations as a gigantic side-splitting farce. Yet for all his faults, he was charismatic and lovable, even to his enemies. Fisk's partner, J. Gould, created an altogether different impression. Gould was slight, consumptive, dark, secretive, scheming, and loathed passionately by all except his family and Russell Sage, the skinflint millionaire usurer and speculator. The son of a poor farmer from Delaware County, New York, Gould worked his way from New York's leather market, the Swamp. His partner in the leather business shot himself after being ruined by Gould, to Wall Street. He became one of the most vilified figures in 19th-century America. "His touch is death," said Daniel Drew from personal experience. "He was not a builder, he was a destroyer," wrote the financial journalist Alexander Dana Noyes. His sometimes partner, the legendary speculator James R. Keene, known as the Silver Fox, called him the worst man on earth since the beginning of the Christian era. "He is treacherous, false, cowardly, and a despicable worm, incapable of generous nature." To Joseph Pulitzer, he was one of the most sinister figures that ever flitted bat-like across the vision of the American people. In his History of Great American Fortunes, Gustavus Myers described Gould as a freebooter who, if he could not appropriate millions, would filch thousands, a pitiless human carnivore glutting on the blood of his numberless victims, a gambler destitute of the usual gambler's code of fairness in abiding by the rules, an incarnate fiend of a Machiavelli in his calculations, his schemes and ambushes, his plots and counterplots. In short, Gould was the epitome of a robber baron. After the Erie War, Fisk and Gould made peace with Vanderbilt at a cost of nearly $5 million paid from the Erie Treasury. The sum included $500,000 paid to the Commodore's associates as compensation for their failed speculation. They soon forced Drew off the Erie board before breaking him in a corner later in the year. The survival of the fittest, Herbert Spencer's axiom of social Darwinism, then popular in the United States, was nowhere in greater evidence than in the stock market. In autumn, Gould flooded the market with new Erie shares and effected a lock-up of greenbacks, in other words, a credit squeeze, which caused railway stocks to crash. After ousting Drew, Gould brought the notorious Tammany boss Bill Tweed onto the Erie board, so as to increase his sway over the city and its judiciary. In less than 6 months, Gould and Fisk had, according to Henry Adams, created a combination more powerful than any that had been controlled by mere private citizens in America or in Europe, since Society for Self-Protection established the supreme authority of the judicial name. They exercised the legislative and judicial powers of the state. They possessed almost unlimited credit, and society was at their mercy. By the end of 1868, Gould was ready to attempt the most audacious speculative feat in history. In his secretive mind he harboured plans to corner the supreme object of speculation and emblem of the age, gold. A man of few words and a supreme cynic, Jay Gould understood well enough the uses of cant. During the Erie War he had posed as the people's champion, raising the cry against Vanderbilt's creeping railroad monopoly. With the gold scheme in mind, Gould became the farmer's friend. Since the end of the Civil War in 1865, agricultural prices had been falling, mainly as a result of extensions to the railroad system. At the same time, the federal government was withdrawing greenbacks from circulation, which caused gold to fall from nearly 300, in other words, the number of greenbacks required to buy $100 in gold specie in 1864, to around 130 in early 1869. As U.S. exports were paid for in gold, the decline in the gold price made American grain more expensive in Europe. This had a knock-on effect on the Erie Railroad, which derived much of its earnings from shipping grain to the east for export. Gould realized that if the price of gold were to rise, this predicament would be resolved. By posing as a monetary inflationist, he gave his planned gold corner a legitimate political gloss. As the corrupt Senator Dilsworthy declares in The Gilded Age, "I never push a private interest if it is not justified and ennobled by some larger public good." Since the federal gold reserves were over $100 million, compared to a mere $15 million worth in circulation, the success of Gould's plans depended on control of government policy. In early 1869, Gould recruited as an ally in his scheme an aging political lobbyist and speculator named Abel Corbin, who had recently married President Grant's sister-in-law. Through Corbin, Gould gained access to the president, whom he entertained at the Opera House and on Fisk's steamboat in June, occasions which he used to extol the political benefits of allowing the gold price to rise and to impress upon Grant the necessity of halting further federal gold sales. In July, Corbin secured the appointment of Gould's man, General Daniel Butterfield, as assistant treasurer in New York. Gould's next move was to improve his access to credit by taking control of the 10th National Bank. So far, everything was going well, and in late summer Corbin and Butterfield were rewarded with an allocation of $3 million worth of gold bullion at the price of $133. Early in September 1869, Corbin arranged a further meeting with Grant, at which Gould became convinced that the president was prepared to pursue an inflationist policy in order to assist the Western farmers. Gould started buying more gold, although he suffered a setback at the end of the first week in September, when his two partners cashed in their profits and withdrew from the pool. As a result, Gould felt obliged to bring in Fisk, who so far had stood aloof from the scheme. Perhaps Gould felt that Fisk's boisterousness was ill-suited to the fine political manoeuvring required by the situation. It was at this stage, as the game became deeper, that the gold ring started to overplay its hand. They attempted to bribe Grant's private secretary, General Horace Porter, with a $500,000 allocation of gold, but Porter indignantly turned it down. In the middle of September, Corbin was pressured into writing to Grant, who was then on holiday in western Pennsylvania, imploring him to stand firm against further gold sales. The letter was delivered by an Erie employee, who telegraphed to Fisk the brief reply, "Delivered all, right." This was intended to signify merely the successful conveyance of the letter, but was interpreted by the Ring as meaning that the President was in agreement with the letter's contents. In fact, Grant was far from pleased with the letter, and in his obtuse way perceived that Corbyn was involved in a scheme to put up gold. The President instructed his wife to write to Mrs. Corbyn, expressing his unease and advising Corbyn to have nothing to do with the gold speculators. Grant received Corbyn's letter on Sunday, the 19th of September. The following day, gold opened at just under 138, and despite heavy buying by the clique, it remained around that level for the next couple of days. On Wednesday, Fisk boldly entered the gold room, buying heavily and offering bets of $50,000 that gold would reach 145. That evening, after the exchange closed, Gould paid a visit to Corbyn, only to find him in a desperate state, his wife having received Mrs. Grant's letter. Corbyn begged for permission to sell his gold and take his profits, but Gould demurred and ordered Corbyn to keep silent about the letter's contents. Gould now realised that Grant could not be relied upon to restrict further federal gold sales, and that his own situation was perilous. As a result, he decided to unwind his gold position in secret. What followed next is subject to dispute. It has been suggested that Gould did not inform Fisk of his reversal, although this seems unlikely given that the partners did not fall out afterwards. When in later years Gould double-crossed his brokerage partner Harry Smith and the speculator James R. Keane, all Wall Street heard about it. What appears more credible, given Gould's lack of scruples, is that he decided to sell his gold holdings under the cover of Fisk's continuing purchases. Presumably Fisk knew that the gold scheme was doomed, since he placed all his orders through a broker intermediary, William Belden, and wrote nothing down that would make him liable for the debts. Gould was careful to make no sales of gold to Belden or his associates, as the hapless broker's ruin was carefully prepared. On Thursday the 23rd of September 1869, the gold exchange opened in pandemonium, with gold at just under 142. Throughout the day, the smaller bear speculators, operating on tiny margins, were wiped out as the price edged upwards, despite Gould's sales, on a turnover exceeding $325 million. That evening, Belden reported that his brokers held $110 million worth of gold on Fisk's behalf. Early the next day, a day remembered thereafter as J. Gould's Black Friday, a massive crowd gathered in New Street outside the gold room in anticipation of the climax that everyone knew was coming. Not daring to appear directly on the exchange, Gould and Fisk directed operations from the broker Heath's offices in Broad Street. When the market opened at 10 o'clock, 300 brokers gathered nervously around the Cupid statue in the centre of the room. Albert Spires, Fisk's broker, opened the bidding at 150. At 11 o'clock, it was observed that General Butterfield's broker was selling, which suggested that government gold sales were about to commence. Fisk ordered Spires to put the price up to 160, while Gould, employing a dozen brokers, continued his sales. Less than an hour later, word reached the room that Treasury Secretary George S. Boutwell had ordered the sale of $4 million worth of gold. Spires, crazy as a loon, in Fisk's words, carried on bidding at 160, even as the price crashed to 135, and the market descended into chaos. Brokers became quite crazy, or at least irresponsible, and ran, hatless, to and fro, gesticulating and making incoherent bids and offers among others who hardly saw them or realized where they were. Then the rumours grew wilder and wilder, true and false mixed up together. According to Fisk, the atmosphere was not so much sauve-qui-peut as each man drag out his own corpse. The rapid fluctuations bankrupted thousands of margin holders. Mobs formed in Broad Street and outside Gould's brokerage office, and troops were put on alert to enter the financial district. Mindful for their own skins, Gould and Fisk slipped out of Heath's offices by a side entrance and retreated to the Erie Castle, where they were protected by an armed corps of railroad employees. Scores of brokers failed on Black Friday. One of them, named Solomon Marler, shot himself the next day. Fisk cheerfully repudiated his contracts. As he said after the Erie War, nothing is lost save honour. But his brokers Spires and Belden failed, with debts nearing $100 million. Spires was reportedly driven mad by the experience. The Gold Exchange Bank, which operated as the clearinghouse for the gold room, was swamped by over $500 million worth of transactions and gave up attempting to sort them out. The daily rate charged on margin loans, the call rate, rose to over 1,400%, and railroad stocks crashed, Vanderbilt's New York Central falling by nearly 3/4 from its peak. The chaos continued into the following week. One man on Wall Street remained safe. Huddled with his pet judge, Jay Gould shielded himself from his creditors with 12 injunctions. When the wreckage was cleared, his own brokerage firm almost alone stood strong. It was rumoured that Gould had even made $11 million from the debacle. On the subject of profit and loss, however, the Mephistopheles of Wall Street was grimly silent. Jay Cook's Black Thursday. The panic of Black Friday did not bring the era of speculation to a close. The railroads in particular continued to attract huge capital investment. Between 1865 and 1873, the addition of over 30,000 miles of new track, at a cost of nearly $1.5 billion, almost doubled the size of the rail system. This massive investment was fueled by the anticipation that new railroads would produce a rapid settlement of the uninhabited Western Territories, which in turn would make the railroads' huge landholdings rise dramatically in value. When the Union Pacific advertised the sale of its plots in Columbus, Nebraska, it lured potential purchasers with the prospect that a $50 lot may prove a $5,000 investment, and asked of them, "Would you make money easy? Find, then, the site of a city, and buy the farm it is built on." How many regret the non-purchase of that lot in New York, that block in Buffalo, that acre in Chicago, that quarter section in Omaha? In 1869, Jay Cook, the banker who had made his name and fortune distributing federal bonds during the war, took over the Northern Pacific Railroad, whose land grant of nearly 50 million acres in the Northwest was larger than the entire territory of New England. Cook set about hyping the land through a network of agents. His chief publicist, a journalist named Sam Wilkerson, described the railroad's property as a vast wilderness waiting like a rich heiress to be appropriated and enjoyed. Duluth, where the Northern Pacific had a terminus, was promoted as the zenith city of the unsalted seas. Unfortunately, the agents and publicists could not stir up sufficient popular enthusiasm for what became known derisively as Jay Cook's Banana Belt. Cook's Belt was saddled with the responsibility for distributing $100 million of North Pacific bonds, a task made substantially more difficult by the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in July 1870, which halted the flow of European capital to America. By the spring of 1873, fears of an imminent financial crisis were mounting. Conditions in the New York money market were tight, and speculators were forced to pay 0.5% a day on their margin loans. Apparently, these high rates were not sufficient to put them off their game, since in May the Banker's Magazine complained that the excessive demand for margin loans was depriving legitimate business of credit and fostering a growing mania for gambling, which is one of the worst features of the day. The atmosphere was further soured by the continuing revelations of the Credit Mobilier scandal, which undermined investor confidence in the railroads. Nevertheless, intense speculation continued. In the summer, share turnover on the New York Stock Exchange reached 100,000 a day for the first time, and the nation warned of increased bucket shop activity. Uncertainty increased in August when several railroads experienced trouble refinancing their outstanding loans, and newspapers carried stories of forged railroad bonds and shares in circulation. At the end of the first week in September, the New York Warehouse and Security Company announced its insolvency after making imprudent loans to certain Western railroads. On Thursday, the 18th of September 1873, Jay Cook was entertaining President Grant at Ogontz, his lavish mansion in Pennsylvania. That afternoon, at 2:30, It was announced on the New York Stock Exchange that J. Cook & Company had failed. Unable to sell its railroad bonds, the bank had lost the confidence of its creditors. The initial reaction to the collapse of America's leading bank was disbelief. In Pittsburgh, a paperboy was arrested for shouting out the news. Incredulity soon gave way to panic as the stock market collapsed and daily call rates rose to 5%. The next day, crowds thronged the financial district to witness the unravelling of the speculative drama that had entranced the nation for the past decade and a half. Jim Fisk was no longer on the scene, having been murdered by his mistress's lover 2 years earlier, although Vanderbilt continued to contact him through a medium for stock tips. But other characters emerged to play their accustomed roles. Jay Gould viciously shorted stocks, Hetty Green bargain-hunted among distressed stocks, while Cornelius Vanderbilt drove his carriage furiously down Broad Street with the intention of dispersing the crowd and with it the atmosphere of panic. Vanderbilt's son-in-law, Horace Clark, was found dead after the failure of the Union Trust Bank, from which he had borrowed heavily to finance his margin speculations. Daniel Drew, the old man of the street, took his final curtain call as his brokerage, Kenyon, Cox & Company, was swept away in the panic. Declared bankrupt, Drew retreated to his bed, where he covered himself with blankets and fought off the demons born of over half a century's speculation. He died a year later. When the panic continued into Saturday, the president of the New York Stock Exchange announced that, for the first time in its history, the exchange would close until further notice. Anyone who stood on Wall Street, reported the Nation, or in the gallery of the Stock Exchange last Thursday or Friday and Saturday, and saw the mad terror, we might almost say brute terror, like that by which a horse is devoured by a pair of broken shafts hanging to his heels, or a dog flying from a tin saucepan attached to his tail, with which great crowds of men rushed to and fro, trying to get rid of their property, almost begging people to take it from them at any price, could hardly avoid the feeling that a new plague had been sent among men, that there was an impalpable, invisible force in the air, robbing them of their wits, of which philosophy had not yet dreamt. The plague metaphor, first applied to describe a financial crisis by Daniel Defoe in 1720, was revived by a Wall Street broker who described the events of Black Thursday as the worst disaster since the Black Death. The Stock Exchange reopened after 10 days. This time, however, the nation did not escape the consequences of over a decade of speculative excess and overinvestment. Throughout the following winter, factories closed down, railroads discharged employees, banks failed, wages were cut, and money was hoarded. By the end of 1873, over 5,000 commercial failures had been announced, among them the Northern Pacific Railroad and nearly 50 New York brokerages. In January, a crowd of unemployed protesters rioted in Tompkins Square, New York, and were charged by mounted police armed with billy clubs. The Depression continued for the remainder of the decade. By 1877, it was estimated that only a fifth of the labour force was in regular employment. Strikes and unrest became frequent. The conflict between capital and labour escalated into violence with the terrorist activities of the Molly Maguires in the Pennsylvania coalfields and the riots in Pittsburgh during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. In New York, a religious revival movement thrived in response to the apparent endlessness of the Depression. The evangelist Dwight L. Moody, together with the gospel singer Ira Sankey, filled huge halls in the city, where attendance was noticeably drawn from the Wall Street and Fifth Avenue crowd, driven perhaps by a desire to atone for their sins, which had brought the nation to its parlous state. Peculation, speculation, and manipulation. After the advent of the ticker machine, it became a saying on Wall Street, "Don't argue with the tape, don't buck the market." It was also said that there is no such thing as a free lunch, which meant that easy profits are not to be found in the stock market. Such adages suggest a market acting efficiently, where risk is offset by reward and market price is a reflection of true or fair value. Market operators were happy to promote a view of speculation that fitted this benign picture. When the stockbroker Henry Clews gave testimony to a legislative committee in 1881, he argued that speculation is a method for adjusting differences of opinion as to future values, whether of products or of stocks. It regulates production by instantly advancing prices when there is scarcity, thereby stimulating production, and by depressing prices when there is overproduction. Speculation, Clews added impudently, was also one of the most beneficial agents in the business world for the prevention of panics. While Clews's depiction of speculation might have come straight from the pages of a modern economics textbook, it does not adequately or even honestly describe the nature of American speculation in the second half of the 19th century. The role of speculation was not limited to regulating the distribution of capital and the forces of production. In reality, its influence was far broader and more sinister. Periods of speculation had always fostered dishonesty, but in the 19th century American stock market this tendency was even more pronounced. The corruption of speculation was not limited to company promoters and stock operators. It infected the entire political class in the 1860s. Even 3 decades later, the reforming President Grover Cleveland was implicated in a stock market pool arranged by James Keene. The rogue trader, much in evidence in the 1990s, was a common figure in 19th century Wall Street. According to James Medbury, writing in 1870, the story of financial irregularities caused by unsuccessful stock speculations is one of the somberest chapters of our recent history. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, there were many infamous cases of financial fraud in the United States. Robert Schuyler's railroad stock forgery in 1854, E.B. Ketchum's gold certificate forgery in 1865, and forgeries of railroad stock at the brokerage White & Company in 1868, which caused losses estimated at $10 million. In 1884, massive frauds were discovered at the brokerage house of Grant & Ward, where General Grant was a partner, albeit of the sleeping variety, which according to Alexander Dana Noyes were accompanied by individual wrongdoing of a kind and on a scale for which even the lax financial morality of those days provided no precedent. During the Gilded Age, frauds by speculating employees of brokers were so common that Medbury claimed, "Every day clerks are discharged for dishonesty. There is hardly a house in the whole money quarter that has not suffered from peculation." Trustees and guardians also speculated with their charges' property. In February 1869, it was discovered that the Metropolitan Church trustees were using $2 million of church funds in personal stock transactions. It is difficult to ascertain whether the prevalence of speculation actually lowered moral standards, or whether the moral decay of the era simply manifested itself through speculation. It is clear, however, that speculation and financial fraud were frequent bedfellows. Far more serious than the lone activities of rogue traders was the persistence of manipulation by operators in the stock market. This undoubtedly undermined the beneficial aspects of speculation claimed by Clews, and made speculation the cause of frequent panics and depressions. As Matthew Smith noted towards the end of the century, men who corner stocks in Wall Street can produce a panic in an instant that will be felt like an earthquake. A Wall Street panic comes suddenly, like thunder from a blue sky. No shrewdness can foresee, and no talent avert it. Speculative manipulation both soured the relationship between directors and shareholders, leading to serious mismanagement, and drove share prices away from their intrinsic or fair value. Charles Dow, the founder of the Wall Street Journal, divided stock market movements into 3 classes: the result of changes in intrinsic value, the product of manipulation, and the outcome of daily trading. Stock speculators, he suggested, focused on the movements caused by manipulation. The vagaries of manipulation, according to Medbury, gives even to irrefragable values the quality of quicksilver. When Jay Gould, as president of the Erie, was asked about the railroad's actual value, he replied brazenly, "There is no intrinsic value to it, probably. It is speculated in here and in London, and it has that value." In other words, the value of one of the world's great railroads derived solely from its attraction as a Wall Street fancy. Although the markets are far better regulated today than in the 19th century, the speculator's propensity for manipulation has not diminished with time. In May 1991, a bond trader at Salomon Brothers was discovered attempting to corner the market in 2-year U.S. Treasury notes. Attracted by rising stock prices during the 1990s bull market, the American mafia became involved in several pump-and-dump schemes for penny stocks. In the online investment world, manipulation and false rumors abound. One of the most spectacular examples of stock ramping in history occurred in the spring of 1996, when the share price of Comparator, a failed manufacturer of fingerprint identification technology, with net assets of less than $2 million and cumulative trading losses of around $20 million, soared from 3 cents to $1.75, at which price the company's market capitalization exceeded $1 billion. On the 9th of May 1996, 177 million Comparator shares were traded on the Nasdaq exchange, a record figure for an individual company. Belatedly, the Securities and Exchange Commission intervened and suspended trading in the stock. Less than a year later, in the early spring of 1997, the share price of Bre-X, a Canadian gold mining operation quoted on the Vancouver Exchange, soared from a few cents to 280 Canadian dollars, valuing the company at nearly $7 billion. The company purported to have discovered 200 million ounces of gold on its Indonesian mining concession. Tragically, in late March, the company's deputy geologist fell to his death from a helicopter over the Borneo jungle. Bre-X's own demise followed shortly after, when its auditors released a report condemning what they called a fraud without precedent in the history of mining anywhere in the world. By this date, however, the company's chief executive had cashed in his profits and was enjoying an extended holiday on some sunny island beyond the reach of the law. Such are the tales of a modern Gilded Age. Believers in efficient markets claim that speculators help to discover values, and that stock prices move randomly because they reflect all information relevant to their value. In the 19th century American market, however, intrinsic values were actually hidden by the operations of speculators. Under such conditions, the outsider could only trust to luck in making an investment decision. This suggests a random walk of a very different nature, not the randomness of efficiency, where every share price reflects its current inherent value, and future changes in price come about only on the receipt of new information, but the randomness of manipulation, where a stock might be bulled, bared, trapped, gunned, or cornered at the whim of a small clique of operators. As one stock market commentator advised in the middle of the century, the most rational mode of deciding, in our opinion, with regard to the expediency of being a bull or a bear, is to close one's eyes, toss up a penny, and abide by the result. What were known as the 3 M's, mystery, manipulation, and thin margins, hindered the stock market from fulfilling its theoretical function of allocating capital efficiently. Instead, railroads were placed where they were not needed, companies were crippled that might have prospered had they kept away from the stock market, and stock market panics caused unnecessary bank failures. At the end of the 19th century, the American economist H.C. Emery wrote that, whereas gambling consists in placing money on artificially created risks of some fortuitous event, speculation consists in assuming the inevitable economic risks of changes in value. In the American stock market, however, the greatest risks were neither inevitable nor strictly economic, since they were mostly the creation of market operators. Samuel Johnson defined gambling as the redistribution of wealth without an intermediate good. The speculation of the Gilded Age conformed to Dr. Johnson's definition. It brought more harm than good, and transferred property from the hands of the many into the pockets of the few. Chapter 7. The End of a New Era. The Crash of 1929 and its Aftermath. The four most expensive words in the English language are "This time it's different," attributed to Sir John Templeton. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau, declared the eminent Yale economist Irving Fisher in the autumn of 1929. A few weeks after this oracular pronouncement, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had declined by more than a third. The worst was still to come. On the 8th of July 1932, the Dow Jones closed at 41.88, a drop of nearly 90% from its 1929 peak. The stock market chart of these years resembles a precipice rather than a plateau. Why did Professor Fisher get things so wrong? The answer is that he had fallen for the decade's most alluring idea, a thesis which underpinned the great bull market of the late 1920s. He believed that America had entered a new era of limitless prosperity. In fact, the notion of the dawning of a new age of capitalism had appeared in several former speculative periods. Disraeli had asserted that the boom of 1825 would not turn to bust, because the period was distinguished from previous ages by superior commercial knowledge. The 19th century journalist Walter Bagehot claimed that during each speculative revival, merchants and bankers fancy the prosperity they see will last always, that it is only the beginning of a greater prosperity. Alexander Dana Noyes, the financial editor of the New York Times during the 1920s, remembered the stock market boom at the beginning of the century associated with the creation of the great trust companies, such as U.S. Steel, as the first of such speculative demonstrations in history which based its ideas and conduct on the assumption that we were living in a new era, that old rules and principles and precedents of finance were obsolete, that things could safely be done today which had been dangerous and impossible in the past. This new era came to an end in the panic caused by the Northern Pacific corner in May 1901. It was soon forgotten, only to be replaced by a far more powerful and persuasive new era argument that came to the fore in the second half of the 1920s. The first premise of the new economics, as it was otherwise called, was that the business cycle, the periodic undulations of trade first observed in Sir William Petty's Successions of Dearth and Plenty back in the 17th century, had been effectively abolished by the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Before this date, financial crises in the United States had been exacerbated by the absence of a central bank to provide funds to the banking sector during periods of instability. The Federal Reserve, with its ability to control interest rates and conduct open market operations, buying and selling government bonds in order to affect the supply of money available to banks, was hailed in the 1920s as the remedy to the whole problem of booms, slumps, and panics. As a result, bankers and speculators alike were lulled into a false security which led them to operate irresponsibly, exacerbating the severity of the ensuing crisis. Alongside the belief in the omnipotence of the Federal Reserve, a variety of additional explanations were offered for the endurance of the Coolidge prosperity, which had commenced with the election of President Calvin Coolidge in 1924, and promised to continue into the administration of his successor, Herbert Hoover. They included the extension of free trade, the decline of inflation, and a more scientific style of corporate management, associated with the alumni of the recently established Harvard School of Business Administration and the automated car production lines of Detroit, known in the managerial techno-speak of the day as Fordism. Better management brought improvements in productivity and lower levels of inventory stocks. The excessive build-up of inventory was believed to be the most common cause of the economic cycle. Professor Fisher argued that modern production is managed by captains of industry. These men are specially fitted at once to forecast and to mould the future within the realms in which they operate. The industries of transportation and manufactures, particularly, are under the lead of an educated and trained speculative class. Fisher found other reasons to be optimistic. The relaxation of the antitrust laws during Coolidge's presidency allowed for a series of mergers of banking, railroad, and utility companies that promised greater economies of scale and more efficient production. Gains in productivity, which rose by over 50% between 1919 and 1927, were ascribed to increasing investment in research and development. American Telephone and Telegraph employed over 4,000 scientists, and over 100,000 applications were lodged with the Commissioner of Patents at the end of 1928. Fisher also celebrated the compliant attitude of labour after the Great Red Scare and strikes of the early 1920s. His most singular New Era argument, however, lay in the benefits he saw flowing from prohibition, which had begun in 1920. Fisher cited the work of Professor Paul Nystrom of the Columbia Business School, who concluded that a dry nation would increase the efficiency of workers and switch demand from liquor to home furnishings, automobiles, musical instruments, radio, travel, amusements, insurance, education, books, and magazines. Fisher was not the only proponent of the new era. In 1927, John Moody, founder of the credit ratings agency, declared that no one can examine the panorama of business and finance in America during the past half-dozen years without realizing that we are living in a new era. In April of that year, Barron's, the investment weekly, envisaged a new era without depressions. Bernard Baruch, the patrician Wall Street financier who later excoriated the new economics, argued in 1929 that the prospect of peace and free trade, improved statistical information, better understanding of economics among businessmen, and cooperation among the world's central bankers were producing an industrial renaissance in the United States. Even Herbert Hoover's presidential nomination acceptance speech in the summer of 1928, when he declared the end of poverty to be in sight, was marked by the prevailing New Era optimism. If the economic fundamentals of the country had changed, and panics along with cyclical fluctuations were consigned to history, then it followed that these changes should be reflected in the stock market. If corporate earnings were both stable and growing, then a higher value should be attached to them. In 1924, the year of Coolidge's election and the beginning of the great bull market, Edgar Lawrence Smith published a little book entitled Common Stocks as Long-Term Investments. In this work, Smith attempted to overthrow the conventional wisdom that common stocks were solely a medium for speculation. Given the history of American stock markets, such an attitude was understandable, argued Smith, but it had led investors to exaggerate the dangers of stocks to those who bought them as long-term investments. Applying a statistical analysis to the investment returns of bonds and stocks from the middle of the 19th century onwards, Smith showed that stocks had outperformed bonds, especially during the inflationary period of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Smith's conclusion was axiomatic. Even when stocks were bought at a market peak, there is definitely to be expected a period in which we may recover as many dollars as we have invested. Translated into statistical terms, he found that in any 15 period there was only a 1% chance of a stock market investor suffering a loss of principal. Smith concluded the case for stocks with a few more New Era arguments. Management was becoming more responsive to shareholders' interests, and investment research was improving. The result, he forecast, would be improved returns for common stocks in the near future. For Smith, the chief attraction of stocks derived from the compound growth of retained earnings, that is, the earnings of companies that were not paid out in dividends. Another contemporary investment writer, Kenneth Van Strum, supplemented this argument with the observation that bonds, unlike stocks, lost purchasing power during inflationary periods. The writings of Smith and Van Strum brought about a profound change in the public's attitude to stock market investment. They provided an intellectual framework for what was soon called the cult of the common stock. Old yardsticks of valuation, which priced stocks at roughly 10 times earnings and expected dividend yields to be greater than bond yields, were replaced by the discounting of future earnings. By this method, future receipts were reduced to their present value by applying a discount rate, so that $100 paid in 1 year's time, discounted at 10%, is valued today at $90. The discount method of valuation is the most speculative method of valuing stocks, since it relies entirely on estimates of future earnings which remain uncertain. As Keynes wrote in the General Theory, the outstanding fact is the extreme precariousness of the basis of knowledge on which our estimates of the prospective yield have to be made. Our knowledge of the factors which will govern the yield of an investment some years hence is usually very slight and often negligible. Some years later, Benjamin Graham, who commenced his own career as an investor in the 1920s, attacked the methodology of discounting profits. The concept of future prospects, and particularly of continued growth in the future, invites the application of formulas out of higher mathematics to establish the present value of the favoured issues. But the combination of precise formulas with highly imprecise assumptions can be used to establish, or rather to justify, practically any value one wishes, however high, for a really outstanding issue. The more important the goodwill or future earning power factor, the more uncertain becomes the true value of the enterprise, and therefore the more speculative inherently the company's stock. Mathematics is ordinarily considered as producing precise and dependable results, but in the stock market, the more elaborate and abstruse the mathematics, the more uncertain and speculative are the conclusions we draw from them. Calculus gives speculation the deceptive guise of investment. Contemporaries were aware of this problem. In 1929, it was commonly said that the market was discounting not only the future, but the hereafter. Several commentators warned against these new era developments in the pricing of stocks. To forego a fair, normal, current return for the sake of hoped-for enhancement of principal, wrote Lewis H. Haney in the North American Review, August 1929, is speculation, pure and simple. It is not investment, for it takes a chance on the future at the expense of safety in the present. In the same journal, Alan Temple analysed the state of the speculative psychology as the market approached its peak. As stocks cannot be purchased upon the basis of what they are intrinsically worth now, these new-era buyers pay what they hope the shares will be worth in a year from now, accepting the handicap of a year's start in the race ahead, perhaps a lifetime. Over such a period, they say, a few points more or less difference in the price of a stock will be insignificant. Nor does the possibility of a recession worry them very much, so strong is their belief in stability, in the new era, in the destiny of large corporations. He concluded with an attack on E. L. Smith's thesis. The policy of buying stocks at prices which have already discounted the future to a considerable extent constitutes an amendment to the theory of common stock investment as originally outlined, and the amendment conceivably may destroy its validity. It is an irony, not uncommon in the looking-glass world of the financial markets, where proven investment theses tend to lose their validity when acted upon, that the great stock market boom of the 1920s was induced by the statistically reasoned proposition that stocks were neither speculative nor even particularly risky investments. Aside from new era arguments, there were strong reasons to be bullish on stocks in the second half of the 1920s. The indolent President Coolidge, given to catnapping in the Oval Office, followed a personal and economic philosophy of laissez-faire, laissez dormir. In the absence of an ideology for purposeful government, business was venerated. As Coolidge famously expressed it, "The business of America is business." His Treasury Secretary, the wealthy Philadelphia banker Andrew Mellon, agreed. In his opinion, government existed mainly to facilitate business. Indeed, it was no more than a business itself. Mellon set about improving the conditions for business by reducing the top rate of income tax from 65 to 32%, cutting corporation taxes to 2.5%, and slashing capital gains taxes. As a result of these tax cuts, the rich had more money to invest in stocks, companies reported higher after-tax earnings, and more of the profits of speculation could be retained by the players. Mortgaging the future. While the rich became richer during the 1920s, unions were weak, and workers were unable to enjoy the benefits of their improved productivity. At his Baton Rouge plant, Henry Ford employed armed thugs to terrorize his employees against collective action. Unable to maintain their share of the economic surplus, workers experienced a decline in real wages during the decade, and corporate profits rose as a percentage of national income. Capitalism, however, requires consumers as much as savers, and demand was maintained by the massive expansion of consumer credit, then called installment purchases. Radios, fridges, cars and clothes could all be purchased on credit. By the end of the decade, when outstanding installment debt had risen to $6 billion, it was estimated that around an eighth of all retail sales were made on credit. There was a decidedly speculative element in the growth of installment credit. Present consumption was being financed with anticipated earnings. Put another way, in their appetite for immediate gratification, the consumers of the 1920s were devouring their future. When the future eventually arrived, they found the cupboard bare. At the time, however, installment purchases were seen as yet another beneficial new era development. Credit and consumption, it was argued, formed a virtuous circle, since from the immediate increase in prosperity would come the ability to pay off debt. Margin loans comprised another popular source of personal credit during the 1920s. When the stock market rose, investors could cash in some of their profits by increasing their margin loans and use the money to make good any shortfall in their earnings. Margin loans climbed in tandem with the stock market in the second half of the 1920s. By October 1929, brokers' loans and bank loans to investors had reached a total of nearly $16 billion. At this level, they represented roughly 18% of the total capitalization of all listed stocks. As we have seen, margin loans had long been considered a source of instability in the American financial system. President Coolidge, however, viewed the escalation of stock market credit without concern. In January 1928, he announced that margin loans were no cause for concern. They were, he claimed, merely rising in line with bank deposits and stocks. As the bull market continued, others became less sanguine. The Federal Reserve in Washington, the institution that had supposedly abolished panics, had inadvertently ignited the stock market boom by lowering interest rates in 1925. This policy was intended to accommodate the Bank of England, which was suffering from an outflow of gold after a disastrous return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. In the summer of 1927, the Fed bowed once more to British demands, backed by the French and Germans, and lowered the discount rate to a record low of 3.5%. Faced with the growth of speculation, the Fed changed tack, and from February 1928 successively raised the discount rate until it reached 6% in August 1929. Yet the profits from buying shares on margin were simply too enticing. As long as the market continued rising, speculators were prepared to pay more for their margin loans. While interest rates remained too low to restrain speculation, they became too high for the economy as a whole, or what in the 19th century used to be called legitimate commerce. In February 1929, the Federal Reserve warned its member banks that it did not consider brokers' loans a suitable use for funds, But this attempt to restrain speculation through moral suasion was equally ineffective. One reason margin loans proved intractable was that they were increasingly supplied by American corporations and foreign banks, neither of which were responsive to the Federal Reserve. Companies boosted their profits by raising funds in the stock market, which cost around 4% in dividends, and lending their surplus cash in the call loan market at rates of up to 15%. Stock prices, in turn, were propelled forward by speculators buying shares on margin. The effect of call loans on the stock market, in the words of one contemporary, was truly a vicious circle. Selling stocks. Brokerage houses expanded rapidly in the second half of the decade, with nearly 600 branch offices opening in 1928 and 1929, an increase of over 80%. In the summer of 1929, Mike Meehan, the broker-cum-pool operator, opened the first brokerage office on a transatlantic liner using new wireless technology supplied by the Radio Corporation of America. Equipped with the new era ideology of common stock investment and a limitless supply of brokers' loans, American financial institutions began applying new hard-sell methods in their dealing with retail investors. Although American commercial banks were forbidden to deal in securities, they circumvented the law by using fully owned affiliates to handle their stock and bond sales. This practice was pioneered after the First World War by Charles E. Mitchell, the president of the National City Bank, who established the National City Company to sell securities to the public. Mitchell, a former electrical goods salesman, ran the business in an aggressively commercial fashion. Securities were first manufactured, then distributed, in Mitchell's words, like so many pounds of coffee. Potential clients were viewed as prospects, and sales staff were urged to lie in wait and pounce on them outside nightclubs, railway stations, and bucket shops. Other clients were drawn from the parent bank's customers, a practice now known as cross-selling. Quotas were instituted and sales contests organized in order to keep the salesmen on their toes. After the Great War, the United States emerged as the world's leading creditor nation, and the stock market boom was accompanied by an explosion of speculative lending to foreign countries. The National City Company became a prominent distributor of high-yielding bonds from South American and Central European states to American investors. In 1928, it sold bonds for Minas Gerais, a Brazilian state, despite an internal company report highlighting the inefficiency and ineptitude and complete ignorance, carelessness and negligence of the former state officials in respect to external long-term borrowing. The term Mitchellism came to describe the peddling of second-rate securities to the public. Charles Mitchell became the most prominent cheerleader of the bull market. As an advocate of the new era ideology, he informed the public that stocks were as safe as bonds. Throughout the summer and early autumn of 1929, he remained indefatigably bullish. In August, he cabled Bernard Baruch from the grouse moors of Scotland with the message that the stock market was like a weather vane pointing into a gale of prosperity. In Germany, a few weeks later, he declared that the industrial condition of the United States is absolutely sound. Nothing can arrest the upward movement. On the eve of the crash, he assured investors that stocks had already declined too far, and that he knew of nothing fundamentally wrong with the stock market or the underlying business or credit structure. The public, he added, is suffering from broker's loanitis. When the crash came, he personally borrowed and lost millions of dollars in a failed attempt to support his bank's share price. Mitchell resembled a snake oil peddler who had come to believe in his own pitch. Pools of speculators. In a nation where 1/20 of the population controlled 9/10 of all wealth, the stock market was naturally dominated by the wealthier class of speculator. Among the rich speculators, two groups stood out. The first comprised businessmen who had made their first fortunes in the automobile industry and later turned to the stock market for their entertainment. According to Professor Charles Amos Dice of Ohio State University, these men were particularly well suited to speculative activities, since they did not come into the market hampered by the heavy armour of tradition. The Detroit crowd, as they were known, included Walter Chrysler, the car manufacturer, the Fisher brothers, whose family firm produced car bodies, and John J. Raskob, a director of General Motors. The most flamboyant member of this group was William Crapo Durant, the founder of General Motors. He had resigned from the company in 1920 after losing a fortune speculating in its stock, and thereafter dedicated his professional energies to stock operations, which he conducted on a grand scale. In 1929, Durant's investment pool was rumoured to control more than $4 billion worth of stocks, roughly $38 billion at today's prices, and his profits from speculation were estimated at over $100 million. Although in his private life Durant displayed certain eccentricities, he travelled everywhere with a folding barber's chair and had all his meals prepared at home and driven in to work, his speculations were straightforward and always on the bull side. Irish Americans comprised another leading clique of speculators. They included Charles Mitchell, raised in the immigrant Boston suburb of Chelsea, Mike Meehan, another Irish Bostonian, who had earned his living as a Broadway ticket tout before turning broker, and organized two famous pools in the stock of the Radio Corporation of America, Bernard Selim Ben Smith, the trader who managed the radio pool for Meehan, Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the future president, who famously sold out before the collapse, and J. Reardon, the president of the Country Trust Bank, and another member of Meehan's radio pool, who lost his fortune in the crash and committed suicide a few days later. Born mostly into poverty and excluded by their religion from the East Coast financial elite, which was dominated by WASPs and German Jews, these men were prepared to take great risks in order to establish themselves. As outsiders, their speculations conformed to the observation of the 18th century financial writer Thomas Mortimer: "He who values not his neck, because he is conscious it is worth nothing, may take the boldest leap." Whereas in the 19th century the vulnerability of the stock market to manipulation had tended to frighten away the public, the operations of the major players in the 1920s served as an enticement to outsiders who hoped to share in the good fortune of a Durant by hanging on to his coat-tails. Rumours that pool operators were taking a stock in hand were eagerly received. Taking advantage of the public's weakness, one pool operator bribed journalists on several newspapers to plant stories. Mike Meehan's first pool in the stock of Radio Corporation of America, which propelled RCA's share price from 95.5 to 160 in only 10 days in March 1928, was credited with reviving bullish sentiment in the market. Mitchell's National City Company left nothing to chance. In late 1928 it joined a pool in Anaconda Copper, whose shares it sold on, at inflated prices, to its own clientele. In 2 months the company offloaded 1.25 million Anaconda shares to the public, making a profit of more than $20 million at a time when the price of copper actually declined by over 25%. Anaconda shares subsequently fell from $125 to less than $4. Company directors were also frequent pool members. Both the chairman and president of Anaconda were involved in the pool in their company's stock, along with Percy Rockefeller and James Stillman, who were directors of the National City Bank. Walter Chrysler operated a pool in the stock of his own company, while Mrs. David Sarnoff, the wife of the founder and chairman of Radio Corporation of America, was a member of Meehan's radio pool. In late 1928, Harry T. Sinclair, the oil man implicated earlier in the decade in the Teapot Dome scandal, involving the corrupt distribution of naval oil reserve leases during President Harding's administration, hired the speculator Arthur Cutten, along with Chase Securities Corporation, an affiliate of Chase National Bank, and Blair and Company, an investment bank, to drive up the share price of Sinclair Consolidated Oil Corporation. The successful operation netted the syndicate a profit of $12 million. In this case, Both the presidents of Blair and Company and Chase National were also directors of Sinclair Oil. It was estimated that during 1929 the stocks of over 100 companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange were subject to similar pool manipulations. A ballyhoo for stocks. Although the total number of stock market players in the late 1920s is variously estimated at between 1 and 2 million out of a population of over 120 million, the bull market attracted a public interest far exceeding these numbers. As J.K. Galbraith observed, the striking thing about the stock market speculation of 1929 was not the massiveness of the participation, rather it was the way it became central to the culture. The stock market lured the leading celebrities and entertainers of the age, including Groucho Marx, Irving Berlin, and Eddie Cantor, the Ziegfeld Follies comedian, who all speculated on margin and eventually lost fortunes. Charlie Chaplin was more fortunate. He sold his stocks in 1928 and remained in cash thereafter. In the stock market of the Roaring Twenties, Americans found a secular religion whose ludic qualities, cynicism and materialism reflected the zeitgeist of the Jazz Age. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, a tale of hope and disillusionment, is a parable for the era. Its hero, Jay Gatsby, is a self-made man with deluded social ambitions. Born in the Midwest, the breeding ground for many of the great 19th century speculators, he has risen from poverty to great wealth by mysterious means involving bootlegging and forged bonds. His romantic dream is rooted in materialism. The well-born Daisy Buchanan, the object of his love, is described in his own words as having a voice full of money and can only be attained with riches. Gatsby's decadent parties are compared to Trimalchio's feast in Petronius's Satyricon. "We are meaner than flies. Flies have their virtues. We are nothing but bubbles," says one of Trimalchio's guests, an observation that links the vanities of ancient Rome and its forum to those of Long Island and Wall Street. For the evanescent Gatsby, the epitome of the homo bulla of humanist discourse, the price for living a single dream too long is death. A similar fate lay in store for the nation's speculators. The 1920s were an age of women's emancipation. Employed in ever greater numbers since the war and granted the vote in 1920, women enjoyed greater social freedom. They smoked, danced to the music on the radio, and in the face of the law drank cocktails. The motor car provided them with the freedom to enjoy illicit sexual encounters, and was denounced by one preacher as the house of prostitution on wheels. More than ever before, women came to exercise their economic franchise in the stock market. In an article entitled Ladies of the Ticker, published in the North American Review in the spring of 1929, Eunice Fuller Barnard reported that Wall Street had finally arrived in Fifth Avenue. In the hotels of Upper Broadway, special brokers' rooms were set aside for women, where, according to Barnard, day in and day out, through a long 5 hours, aggressive and guttural dowagers, gum-chewing blondes, shrinking spinsters who look as if they belonged in a missionary society meeting, watch, pencil in hand, from the opening of the market till the belated ticker drones its last in the middle of the afternoon. It was estimated that women possessed over 40% of the nation's wealth and accounted for 35% of stock market turnover. Their presence was heavy in the shareholder registers of America's largest companies. They owned over 30% of the shares in U.S. Steel and General Motors, and more than 50% of the shares in American Telephone and Telegraph and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which became known as the Petticoat Line. It was a sign of the times that J. Raskob of General Motors chose the Ladies' Home Journal to publish his essay entitled "Everybody Ought to be Rich," where he suggested that through a judicious selection of stocks and the application of debt, a small regular investment would inevitably turn into a large fortune. Women were said to provide the main impetus behind the bull market. "In the past year," wrote Eunice Barnard, The growth of the woman investor and the woman speculator has been amazing, and it is getting larger almost weekly. They came from all classes: heiresses, stenographers, businesswomen, housewives, farmers' wives, cleaning ladies, waitresses, telephone girls, cooks, and washerwomen. Rumours circulated of great fortunes attained by the lady bulls. It was argued that as women spent the household money, they knew better than their husbands which retailing and manufacturing stocks to invest in. They were said to be good losers. A lady speculator told the financial journalist Edwin Lefebvre that she had lost $1 million. "I had a perfectly stunning time while it lasted. I never knew what fun it was to make money." Yet some brokers found their female customers to be hard losers, naggers, stubborn as mules, and suspicious as servants. As in earlier periods, there was a feminist angle to women's involvement in the stock market. "Women are at last taking a hand in man's most exciting capitalist game," wrote Eunice Barnard. "For the first time they have the interest, the self-assurance, and the entrance fee. If they become intelligent players, and if to any extent they should win financial power, they would probably, in our economic society, as a matter of pragmatic fact, do more to raise the level of common respect for women as a class than all the hard-fought suffrage campaigns." The pick of the stocks. The speculator's fancy for new technologies was well served by the bull market. The motor car replaced the railroads as both the engine of economic prosperity and the favoured object of speculation. It transformed the culture and geography of the nation. Roads were surfaced, highways built, and garages erected to accommodate the increasing number of passenger cars, which rose from 7 million to 23 million during the 1920s. Over 1 million visitors flocked to view the new Model A at Ford's New York headquarters. The excitement was reflected in the stock market, where General Motors' share price increased over tenfold between 1925 and 1928, an advance so rapid that it put the stock market on the front page of the newspapers. When J. Raskob made his proposal for universal wealth in August 1929, he pointed out that $10,000 invested a decade earlier in General Motors would have grown to more than 1.5 million. The public interest generated by the motor car was exceeded only by that for the radio, first launched by Westinghouse in 1920. The wireless became the purveyor of fashions across the nation. Sales of radio sets rose from $60 million in 1922 to $843 million 6 years later. The new industry was dominated by Radio Corporation of America, often referred to simply as radio, which was both the largest manufacturer of radios and the leading broadcaster. The company's earnings increased from $2.5 million in 1925 to nearly $20 million in 1928, and its stock climbed from a low of 1.5 in 1921 to 85.5 in early 1928. From there, it was propelled by Meehan's pool operations to a high of 114 in 1929, 73 times its earnings, and nearly 17 times book value. RCA was highly leveraged, paid no dividends, and expanded rapidly through acquisitions. In 1929, it was the most heavily traded stock on the New York Stock Exchange, where it was known as the General Motors of the air. The national euphoria following Charles Lindbergh's solo crossing of the Atlantic in 1927 propelled the speculative appeal of the young aircraft industry. Wright Aeronautical, Curtiss, and Boeing Airplane, renamed United Aircraft and Transport in 1929, became favourites in the stock market. The motion picture industry was also attractive to speculators. As Hollywood made the transition from silent films to talkies, the large studios were consolidating their positions, and profits expanded rapidly. In October 1928, Joseph Kennedy merged his movie interests to form the giant RKO, and the following year the Fox Film Corporation paid $72 million for Lowe's chain of movie theaters. The debt taken on by this deal caused Fox's share price to collapse from 106 to 19 after the crash. Contrary to public perception, movie stocks performed badly during the Depression. The appeal of leverage. The dominant feature of the 1920s stock market was not the wild pursuit of speculative innovations, but the use of debt to pyramid investments and enhance gains. With margin loans, speculators could afford to buy AOT, any old thing. As Groucho Marx, who personally borrowed over $250,000 to play the stock market, recalled in his memoirs, during the bull market there was no need to employ a financial advisor to select your stocks. You could close your eyes, stick your finger any place on the big board, and the stock you bought would start rising. Leverage was not confined to individual speculators' margin holdings. It became built into the financial structure of corporate America. Utility and railway companies were consolidated into giant holding companies called systems, an unconscious echo of John Law's Mississippi system, which were constructed upon multiple layers of debt. Samuel Insull, a former secretary to Thomas Edison, constructed a giant utility network in the Midwest, which diversified into tire manufacturing, shoe factories, and real estate. Insull Utility Investments, an investment trust, owned cross-shareholdings in a number of utility companies, each of which was highly leveraged with debt, so that a small rise in the earnings of the operating businesses had a disproportionately large effect on the profitability of the holding company. Profits were also manufactured by subsidiaries selling assets to each other at inflated prices. As the structure of Insull's business empire was too complex for even the sophisticated investor to understand, Insull arranged to sell his company's shares directly to their customers. A frenzy for utility holding companies dominated the last phase of the bull market, their shares reaching a 1929 peak of more than 4 times book value and dividend yields falling to less than 1%. In January 1929, J.P. Morgan, the investment bank, acted as the promoter for the United Corporation, a holding company that produced a fifth of the nation's electricity. It was later revealed that Morgan had retained for itself nearly 2 million warrants, providing the right to subscribe to new shares in the company at a fixed price, and had distributed United's shares at below-market prices to its preferred clients, who included Charles Mitchell of the National City Bank, J.J. Raskob of General Motors, and former President Calvin Coolidge. The fashion for holding companies extended far beyond the utilities. The Van Sweringen brothers, 2 property developers from Cleveland, Ohio, used a complicated structure of holding companies to merge a number of railroads in the Midwest. Their Allegheny Corporation, sitting atop a mountain of debt, was also sponsored by J.P. Morgan. Ivar Kruger, the Swedish match king, built an international chain of monopolies, which controlled around 3/4 of the world's match production. His heavily indebted holding company, Kruger and Toll, financed its operations by issuing bonds in New York. Banks also clustered themselves together. The Transamerica Corporation merged the banking interests of A.P. Giannini, which included the California-based Bank of Italy, and the Bank of America in New York. In Detroit, 2 holding companies, the Guardian Detroit Union Group and the Detroit Bankers Company, had a monopoly on local banking. The holding company concept found its widest application in the field of investment trusts. The purpose of the investment trust, which originated in Scotland in the late 19th century, was to hold the securities of other companies, providing the small private investor with the benefits of professional management and investment diversification at a low cost. They thrived in the bull market. In 1928, over 200 new investment trusts were launched, with combined assets of over $1 billion. 3 years earlier, the combined capital of American investment trusts had been less than $500,000. During the first 9 months of 1929, a new investment trust appeared for every working day, and the industry issued over $2.5 billion worth of securities to the public. Investment trusts were sold to the public with all the puffed-up rhetoric of the new era. In an article published in the summer of 1929, Professor Irving Fisher asserted that the influence of investment trusts is largely toward cutting the speculative fluctuations at top and bottom, thus acting as a force to stabilize the market. Investment trusts buy when there is a real anticipation of a rise due to underlying causes, and sell when there is a real anticipation of fall, thus ensuring that stocks sold more nearly to their true value. The high turnover of shares in the investment trust portfolios was hailed as sound management. It was even argued that investment trust purchases were providing stocks with a new scarcity value. In reality, the effect of investment trusts on the stock market was highly destabilizing. Their managers invested heavily in blue-chip stocks and lent their surplus cash to the call loan market, thus serving both to increase the demand for shares and to stimulate speculation. They borrowed heavily against their assets in order to leverage profits, thereby increasing stock market volatility. The high stock turnover in the trust's portfolios reflected baneful trend following rather than the sober pursuit of intrinsic value. The investment banks, which sponsored the new trusts, frequently dumped stocks into their portfolios that they found difficult to sell elsewhere. As a result, the investors were diversified in junk. Worst of all, several investment trusts invested in the shares of affiliated trusts. The history of the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation is exemplary. Launched in December 1928 with a capital of $100 million, the company first invested $57 million in its own shares. Then, in July 1929, it launched the Shenandoah Corporation, in which it retained a sizable stake. A month later, another investment trust called Blue Ridge issued forth from Shenandoah. As with the systems of Insull and others, the returns of these investment companies were enhanced with leverage. The public was initially enthused by this exercise in what Professor Galbraith has called fiscal incest, and shares in Goldman Sachs Trading rose to nearly 3 times their book value. Not all contemporaries were sanguine. In the summer of 1929, the chairman of the New York State Assembly's Committee on Banks feared that if a crash were to happen, the investors who own investment trust shares would be worth little or nothing after the banks took up the stocks that are given as security for loans. Paul M. Warburg, a prominent banker and a leading figure behind the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, dismissed the investment trusts as incorporated stock pools. Warburg's fears were not confined to the vogue for investment trusts. In March 1929, he alerted readers of the Commercial and Financial Chronicle that history, which has a painful way of repeating itself, has taught mankind that speculative overexpansion invariably ends in overcontraction and distress. If orgies of speculation are permitted to spread too far, however, the ultimate collapse is certain not only to affect the speculators themselves, but also to bring about a general depression involving the entire country. Warburg was not alone in harbouring fears of the possible outcome of the speculative mania. Herbert Hoover, Commerce Secretary under Coolidge, had warned privately since early 1926 that excessive speculation and the overextension of installment credit were threatening the long-term prosperity of the nation. When he assumed the presidency early in 1929, Hoover attempted to address the issue of speculation. Since he did not feel it was constitutionally proper for him to dictate the level of stock prices, he urged newspaper editors to warn their readers about stock prices. Treasury Secretary Mellon, who until this date had been decidedly bullish, was asked to exhort the public to purchase bonds rather than shares. Yet Hoover's admonitions were as ineffective as those of Prime Minister Robert Peel during the railway mania of 1845. The bankers with whom Hoover consulted politely informed him of the tenets of the New Era philosophy, while less eminent Cassandras were told to stop sandbagging America. The madness of crowds. The arguments against the New Era revaluation of stocks, which had sent shares trading to 30 times income, were compelling. Since 1924, share prices had risen 3 times faster than corporate earnings. High interest rates were beginning to throttle economic activity. Installment loans had reached the limits of their expansion since wages were not rising. Gold was flowing to New York from London and Berlin, forcing up European interest rates and weakening their economies with negative consequences for American exports. In the United States, declining agricultural commodity prices brought a reduction in the purchasing power of American farmers, who then comprised a sizable proportion of the population. In August 1929, the North American Review noted, "Over against the mergers, increased exports, growing population, and multiplication of new products, which the prophets of the new era visualize, we must set the possibility of antitrust law enforcement, increased European competition, retaliation to tariff measures, declining price levels, and limited purchasing power." Yet none of these points carried much weight against the prospect of continuing profits from stock speculation. In his introduction to the 1932 edition of Mackay's Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Bernard Baruch suggested that American speculators in 1929 displayed the attributes of a crowd psychology. He cited the German playwright Schiller's dictum that anyone taken as an individual is tolerably sensible and reasonable. As a member of a crowd, he at once becomes a blockhead. Although they were not directly concerned with financial markets, the early studies of crowd or herd mentality conducted by Freud and the 19th century psychologist Gustave Le Bon identified certain features also commonly found in a bull market mentalité. According to Freud and Le Bon, the defining characteristics of a crowd are invincibility, irresponsibility, impetuosity, contagion, changeability, suggestibility, collective hallucination, and intellectual inferiority. The crowd and the stock market have other features in common. They both thrive on uncertainty and rumour. While crowds generally seek out a leader, whom Freud termed the dreaded primal father, this figurehead may be substituted by a common tendency, a wish in which a number of people can have a share. In Crowds and Power, Elias Canetti claimed that money was capable of creating the focus of interest and purpose necessary for a crowd mentality to form. Like the forces behind a bull market, the crowd is inherently unstable. It has no stasis, no point of equilibrium, and is driven by a dynamic either to grow or to shrink. At the moment of its dispersal, a crowd frequently succumbs to panic. It is of the very essence of a panic, wrote Freud, that it bears no relation to the danger that threatens it, and often breaks out on trivial occasions. The intellectual inferiority of the crowd is a sign that people are filtering and manipulating new information to make it accord with their existing beliefs. Psychologists call this behavior cognitive dissonance. Dissonant information, which contradicts the collective fantasy, is uncomfortable and people seek to avoid it. They may do this either by shooting the messenger or by proselytizing and seeking fresh converts to their fold. In his theory of cognitive dissonance, Leon Festinger argued that people will tolerate increasing degrees of dissonance if they are motivated by a sufficiently enticing reward. In financial markets, one might say they are prepared to ignore bad news because they still hunger after the immediate profits of speculation. A description of the speculators in William Fowler's circle during the 1860s provides an illustration of this behavior. They were engaged, wrote Fowler, in bolstering each other up, not for money, for we thought ourselves impregnable in that